Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are in 2 Timothy chapter 1. We're going to be starting verse 12 this lesson. But before we begin, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, let's read verse 12, and he says here, For the which cause I also suffer these things, nevertheless I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. So he says here, in the first part of verse 12, for the which cause I also suffer these things. Now, when he says for the which cause, that phrase is referring back to verse 11, which means he says here in verse 11, Wherefore I am appointed a preacher and an apostle and a teacher of the Gentiles. So basically, what Paul is saying is, because he was a preacher and an apostle and a teacher of the Gentiles, right? For the which cause I also suffer these things. Now, these things here that he's talking about refers to everything that he has that has to do with his imprisonment and his bonds. Remember, Paul now is in prison in Rome. And this imprisonment here is his last. He's going to be put to death with this imprisonment. And the first imprisonment in Acts 27, 28, that was a different imprisonment. And this second one here, this is much more serious. Paul is way much more by himself, and he's pretty much alone. Luke was with him. He wanted Timothy and Mark to come and visit him, but this is a much more severe imprisonment. So he says here, for the which cause I also suffer these things. His imprisonment, the bonds that he was experiencing, and this imprisonment that he's experiencing in 2 Timothy is way much more severe than the imprisonment he experienced in Acts chapter 28. But he says here, I suffer these things nevertheless. He says, so Paul here is going through these sufferings, but he says, nevertheless, I am not ashamed. I'm not ashamed. Now, back in verse 8, if you read verse 8, he says, Be not therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. In verse 8, Paul tells Timothy to not be ashamed of the testimony of his Lord, nor of Paul, who was a prisoner of the Lord. And if you want, you can go back and listen to the messages that I spoke on verse 8. And now here, Paul is saying that Paul also is not ashamed of being a preacher and an apostle and a teacher, nor of being a prisoner for the Lord. So he says, for the which cause I also suffer these things. Because I was a preacher and an apostle and a teacher, I'm suffering these things. Nevertheless, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of being God's prisoner because I preached and teached and took God's message to the world. Remember, verses 8 through 14 of 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1. The gospel is worth suffering for. That's what verses 8 through 14 are talking about. Is the gospel worth suffering for? And Paul said, yes, the gospel is definitely worth suffering for. The reason why Paul is absolutely not ashamed is because of the next thing he says in this verse. So Paul says, I suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed. So why is it that Paul is not ashamed to suffer for the gospel? Because he says, for I know, the reason is because I know whom I have believed. I know whom I have believed. All right. Now, this Greek word for know is oida. It's oida, and it's in the perfect tense. Now, you may say, why is this important? Because in the Greek, there are two main words for know. There's two main Greek words for the English word that we have, know. The first Greek word is gnosko. Gnosko. And gnosko means the beginning or the inception of knowledge. It means beginning knowledge on something, on a subject, all right? But there's another Greek word, which is oida. O-I-D-A, oida. And oida means full or absolute knowledge of something. So you have gnosko, which is the beginning knowledge of something. And then oida, which means you have full knowledge on something, on a subject, or on whatever it is you're studying or want to know. So the Greek word here, Paul says, for I know whom I have believed. This Greek word for know is oida, and it's in the perfect tense. Why is the perfect tense important? Okay? Paul isn't just saying that he knows about God, but that he has a deep, full knowledge of who God is and what he is like. Paul doesn't say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because I have a surface knowledge of, yeah, I know God exists and he's there, and I know he loves me and that stuff, and I guess that's enough. No, that's not what carries Paul into prison and what gets him through prison, right? That's not what that surface knowledge isn't what made him go on the mission field and plant churches. No. Paul didn't have a gnosko knowledge of God. Paul had an oida knowledge of God. He had a full, an assurance, an absolute knowledge of who God is and what he is like. Perfect tense. Perfect tense means that Paul's knowledge is firm and complete, and it's rock solid. Paul's knowledge of God was perfect tense, meaning that it was a complete knowledge, meaning that Paul has no doubts about who God is and what he's like. Paul has a complete knowledge. Now, is it possible that any human being can have full knowledge of God? Of course not. Of course not. I mean, we don't know all about God, and it's not possible for our finite minds to know everything about God. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. If we could know everything about God, he wouldn't be God. But what Paul is saying is that I have a full, deep knowledge. I know for sure. I know who I believe in. I don't need any more information to know who I believe in and what he is like. I know him. And I want to ask you this question. How firm and how secure is your knowledge of God? How well do you know God? Does your knowledge of God go beyond a beginning knowledge? If you listen, this is no condemnation, whatever. This is, if all you can say is yes, Pastor Mark, I believe in God. I believe he's there. I believe that Jesus is God. He loves me and he cares for me. And I read the Bible, right? And I'm happy with that. Does your knowledge of God, is it just a beginning knowledge? Is it just a surface knowledge about God? Or does your knowledge extend into a daily walk with God knowledge? Do you have a daily walk with God knowledge? Do you have a knowledge of God that you pray to him daily and you seek his heart and you want to know more about him? And therefore, to know more about him, you have to study his word. You can't do it without his word. You have to have the Bible and study the Bible and read the Bible to understand what God is like and to get to know him for who he is. Can you say, listen, can you say, I know God? Those of you who are married, do you really know your husband or your wife? Or do you have a surface knowledge of them? Yeah, I know my, I don't think marriages would last very long if the other person just had a surface knowledge of their mate. Yeah, I know a little bit about him, but we got married quickly, right? No, marriages don't last very long when you only have a surface knowledge of the person that you love, a person that you marry. And it's the same with God. Doesn't mean you're not saved if you don't know God deeply. That doesn't mean that at all. What it means is are we, do we know God? Can we say, yes, I know him. I've experienced life with him. He took me through difficult times. He took me through pleasurable times, right? I know him. I've lived with him now for whatever, 5, 10, 25, 35 years. I've prayed and sought his heart. And in that time, I've experienced life with God. Jobs I've had, I've prayed and I've talked to him, and he has ministered to me. I've seen God's work in my life and in people that I've prayed, my family's life, and my parents, my kids, my relatives, right? And people that I work with. I've prayed and I've seen God work. And now it's 27 years later. And I can say I have a much better understanding of God. And I think at times, the longer we're saved, I think a sign, and this is going to sound contradictory, but those of you who are strong in the Lord, and those of you who have spent many years with the Lord will understand what I'm saying. But as we grow in our experience, as we grow in our relationship with God, it's almost like 30 years, 40 years later, we say, the longer I live in my relationship with God, the less I know of God. And that's true. That's true. So here I am in this message saying that we need to grow in our knowledge of God. But at the same time, after, again, those of you who have lived with the Lord long enough, you'll understand the longer we walk with God and pray and seek his heart, it seems like the less we know about him. But that's a good thing. That means you're maturing in God. It means you're getting closer to God. Because the closer we get to God, it almost seems like the less we know about God. Because the closer we get to God, it seems the more vast he seems. When we stand far back from a building, if you go to, let's say you go to a city, you go to Washington, D.C., or you go to New York City and you see the Empire State Building, and you stand 3 miles away from the Empire State Building and you see this huge building. Yeah, I know it. I see it there. Look at it. It's got windows. It's got this on. Oh, yeah. I know. I can see the whole thing. It's an amazing building, right? And that's us at the beginning, at the gnosko knowledge of God. I see God. He's my Father, and the Bible says that Jesus died for us and he loves me, and I know all about that. Oh, yes. right? And we have a 3 mile, we have a distant knowledge of God, right? We see God afar off. But as we draw close to God, as we get closer and closer to that Empire State Building, we begin to see the vastness of it. We begin to see the intricacies of that building. And then we say, you know what? I thought I knew it back years ago. At a distance, I thought I knew God. But now as I draw closer to him, and as I'm looking and I'm seeing so many more little details of this building, it really is big. It's huge, right? And we begin to get close to, he's really big. He's really huge. His understanding is way far beyond mine. I can never understand. But when we stand at a distance, oh, I can know everything about that building. And then we get close to the building, and it's like, no, this is too much for me to understand in this finite mind, right? So, yes, Paul said, for I know God. Paul said, I really know God. But I think if you pressed Paul, I think Paul would say the same thing. You know what? God is so big. He's far beyond our understanding. But Paul, in his life, he did know God. He did have an oida of God, a deeper, fuller understanding. But that fuller understanding only brought him to the point to where he knew that he did not really know the fullness of God. So I'm saying this to encourage you to don't stand so far back from God and be satisfied with just a how can I say, a view of God, a distant view of God. What do I want to say? Like when you take a picture, the panoramic view of God. Don't be satisfied with that. Start walking closer to God. Get closer to him and get deeper and in understanding him. Get closer to his word. Read his word, study, pray, and seek his heart. Hear his word, and be with God's people, and they give testimony, and you learn more about God and God's love and his grace and mercy towards us and the workings of God. And then our knowledge begins to become more oida-like, more full, more we see the vastness of God. All right. So he says, for I know whom I have believed. And we're going to get into that phrase, I have believed, next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.